So, welcome to the inaugural Belonging at Work Summit. I am super thrilled to introduce the audience to my friend, colleague, and incredibly talented diversity, equity, and inclusion rock star, Joel Brown, who is the Chief Visionary Officer of Numos. So, for folks who aren't familiar with Numos, it is a consulting firm that specializes in lots of good stuff like organizational sustainability, leadership development, conflict resolution. We could all use that, executive coaching, and cultural intelligence. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in this interview. And Joel's passion is in helping businesses improve their performance and workplace culture. And he is a master diversity storyteller. And as many of you all know, you're hanging on to the summit because a big component of this year's conversations is talking specifically about diversity storytelling, why it matters, what it is, and most importantly, just getting some tips from Joel on what we can start to do to begin excavating, polishing up our stories, and most importantly, having that confidence to share, our lived experiences. So Joel, welcome to the summit. I'm super, super excited to have you. Are you ready to do this thing?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for making the time. This is going to be a great conversation. So to kick things off, one of your many professional superpowers is in the area of storytelling. Mm-hmm. And I know that in the book that I wrote, you were featured, and I loved how you talked about, your anchor story and kind of the story of where you're going. So mm-hmm. could you open up the interview and share a little bit more with us in your own words of what a diversity story is, and in the context of this conversation for our participants, why it matters too?
Sure. Well, first of all, like I said, once again, thank you. I also want to give a shout out to my colleague and business partner, Jared Carroll, because we started an enterprise called Third Story Revolution, which actually focuses on strategic storytelling. And I've also had the pleasure of teaching overseas in the past year in France this topic. So this is a very, very important thing for me. A diversity story. I think before we answer that question, let's take a step back and just talk about what story is. Yeah. Story is really the easiest and shortest way to build a connection. It is the line between you and another person. It is the way that a person goes from being a stranger to being someone who's a trusted confidant or a kindred spirit. Stories exist all around us. And so the way I look at diversity stories is that it helps to illuminate a person's journey. It encapsulates their triumphs, their struggles, their essence, their worldview. And I think when we think about story, the reason why it's so important, and this may be one of the questions that you ask, is that I think at this point, unless you've been living under a rock, it should be pretty apparent why diversity and inclusion is important, not only for business, for society, for the planet, etc. However, I feel like in this era where there's so many facts and figures being thrown at people, the thing that we need not neglect is the heart-based piece. Mm-hmm. So there's the intellectual side, there's the mental side, and I think we've become very preoccupied in our industry with best practices and action items and whatnot, data, hard science, and those are all relevant and important. But at the end of the day, we've got to remember that part of what diversity work is seeing someone's humanity, recognizing your own humanity in them and making that connection. So then what's the best way to do that? The best way to do that is through a story that allows us to not only understand a person's journey in a more three-dimensional way, but gives us also understanding of how that person's story might also reflect our own journey, our own pathway, and our own values. So that's what it is to me. And it's something where I will tell you, where the facts and figures fail me, the stories never do. Because I think when people understand what my journey has been like as X, Y, and Z, for them to be able to see it and feel it and sense it goes a longer way than simply just saying to them, I think you should do X, Y, and Z because it's the right thing to do. So That's what it is for me.
That's beautiful. And I like that instant heart connection. And I think you're right in the fact that we're, I guess, more in the workplace where it's people want to be attached to kind of seeing the needle move, having that kind of hard science, as you said, to see progress, right? But sometimes I think we forget the higher senses, the importance of empathy. And like you said, I love that kind of a story is the fastest way to connect to another person And so keeping that in mind, I think that definition is really helpful just to ground this conversation. Um, can you share specifically an example just from your own work of
Hmm.
how you've personally leveraged storytelling as a skill, um, as a vehicle, more specifically for creating a more inclusive workplace?
Sure. Let me see. So one story house. Let me think about this. For example, I've done a lot of restorative justice circles, and I've worked with a number of organizations and companies. And I think one of the things that's really important for people is to understand and just sometimes take a step back and say, why is this work important to you? Because we can be so focused on platitudes and these principles and concepts that, while important, once again take us away from understanding who the person is. So one of the things I love to do with people in corporations or in nonprofits or even the government sector when I'm coming in to do D&I work is to say, as a team, as a group, as a company, what's your story? And everybody has a story. The challenge, of course, is that a number of people, particularly people in privileged groups, don't feel that their story is relevant. And for those of us who are from underrepresented groups, we don't feel that our stories are going to be heard. So you have to create the safety for both to say, yes, even as a cisgender white male, your story is very important. I want to understand a little bit more about you. And I think historically, we've heard a number of those narratives over time. We also want to elevate the stories of those who have been invisible. So if you're a woman, you're Latinx, you're LGBTQ, you're a person with a disability, to say, what's your experience? And I think through those experiences, then it becomes easier, first of all, to build the safety, build the connection, and to lay the foundation for the relationships. And I think from there, then you can start talking about how do we create more inclusive experiences, which is yet another story. How do we create better opportunities for people to connect and change the narrative? Because everybody within the organization has a narrative. That narrative can be positive, it can be negative, or it can be kind of middle of the road. If everybody or most people are not having a positive experience, I think it is incumbent upon the leadership to figure out what we can do. But you can't know that unless you know the story. And I think you can't really build safety if you don't know people's motivations. And I think that's where it's really critical, is to give people that space so they can start sharing those types of things.
Yeah, yeah. There's a quote up. I will probably butcher it, but it's the like really understanding your why you can endure any how, right? And I think in the storytelling piece, and we'll get to this later on. But I really liked what you said, and I hope we can return to this of looking at underrepresented folks in the workplace, knowing that we have stories to share, and kind of just pausing, because there's the risk of sharing, and then, like you said, people not listening or not valuing what you're bringing to the table, and then kind of looking at more enfranchised folks, kind of dominant folks in the workplace, of feeling that your story doesn't matter, right? And so there's this kind of interesting dynamic going on, and so we'll definitely unpack that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the work you do in cultural intelligence, and so. First, can you talk a little bit with the audience of what you mean by like this concept of cross-cultural dialogue, and then if you will, just describe how effective storytelling can build strong cross-cultural relationships in the workplace.
Wow, that's a lot. So let me just make sure I get it all together. So First of all, cultural intelligence, what is it?
Yeah.
To me, it's the ability to manage cultural differences and cultural similarities, is the ability to navigate a multicultural environment. Now, how does that play out? So once I had a client, and the client said, we are trying to work with underrepresented populations, and we need to know everything that we possibly can about them. And I said, well, if you're asking me to do that, I'm the wrong person. There's no way that I can tell you everything that you need to know. I don't know everything that one would need to know. And I said, I doubt there's anyone who knows everything. But you want to find a way to be curious, to be adaptive, to be empathetic. Those are the key things. And those are sort of the cornerstones of cultural intelligence. Are you aware of your own worldview? Are you open to new ideas? Do you recognize that there is a difference? Are you able to hold that space? But then what do you do with it once you recognize it? Because you can also have people who are very paralyzed, or maybe I shouldn't say paralyzed. There's some confusion, or maybe there's a difficulty in trying to discern what is the right type of action I should take. And so what we want people to do is to be adaptive and to be able to be in environments and to be able to adjust and shift how they behave, how they show up, how they think based on what's going on with others, and also to be aware and be able to hold space for themselves as well. That's cultural intelligence. And so that's what's really important in this topic. Now, in terms of intercultural communication, I think what happens, and I'm doing a lot of work right now on dialogue. So, with this year, we're launching new programs and series, and one of them is called Uncommon Dialogue, which is helping people to learn how to dialogue more effectively. And part of what has to happen is, and this is going to sound cliche, people have to learn how to listen. We're in an era where a lot of what's taking place is people are, dropping Facebook posts and Twitter posts in their Twitter feed, but they're not really, where is the opportunity to actually hear and to discern? And so when you share a story, number one, just from a brain standpoint, for a person to be able to hear a story, it really deactivates stereotypes because a person is able to sense things in a more visceral way than they are just by hearing a fact or a figure. It's something that, and I don't want to get too nerdy and go too much into neuroscience, but it really changes how the brain perceives things. So number one, stories have that type of effect. And at the same time, I think because a lot of the work environments that people are in are kind of bland and they don't have a lot of energy, what's going to stand out? What's going to allow you to really understand people? What's the story? It's not going to be another workshop or presentation on why diversity 101. Those may have some utility, but we need to get back to the story piece. I forgot your third question. So you were asking beyond intercultural communication, something else?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is excellent. The last part of the question was just if you could describe how effective storytelling can begin to build those strong cross-cultural relationships. So you've entered into a dialogue, but how do you start building across differences in the workplace?
Well, I think because you start to, those quote unquote differences start to become less mysterious. And in fact, you realize that there's more similarity. Now, the challenge is, for me, when I've been in diverse circles, is that I'm really mindful of not creating unnecessary or disproportionate burden for people of color or for underrepresented people to do all the sharing, while those who are enfranchised are kind of quiet and taking it all in. And, it's kind of, some people might even call it like diversity porn. So you're just listening to people talk and talk and talk, but there's no sharing. There has to be equity. Yeah. And so one of the things that we're really focused on too in the work that we do is also storytelling ethics. There's a way in which storytelling has to be set up in a business or an organization so that it's safe, that it's rich, and that there's equity involved. And what do I mean by that? Recognizing the power of the people in the room, recognizing the power differential of some people, and recognizing that there's a different calculation for certain people, and that while I, as a CEO, might be able to share a story about X, Y, and Z, if I'm a person of color, if I'm LGBTQ, if I'm a woman, am I able to share a story that challenges the existing narrative? What will be the repercussions for that? And sometimes I've seen people say, hey, we all should tell story, but they haven't done the requisite work first and making sure that there's safety. Yes. Because if I shared my story, part of what may be, it's implicit but maybe not fully stated, is if I shared my story, which is based upon my truth, it may not necessarily be something that you've considered. It may be something that you find offensive. It may be something that you disagree with. So how are you going to handle that? And I think that's also going to be a critical piece of intercultural communication. So it goes back to the resiliency. Am I able to share something with you? And are you able to stay invested in the conversation to recognize that despite whatever world you occupy, whatever story you share, this story is real for people? And I think that's the key thing. What I'm sharing, our realities are all relative, and they're going to be different for each person. We're not talking about fantasy, but we're talking about the fact that your lived experiences have impact. They live in your body, they live in the cells and in the soul of who you are. Yeah. So as we hear that, we have to appreciate that. We have to acknowledge that. And I think as we hear something that we don't particularly care for, we also have to be able to stay resilient, stay present and focused, and also show some curiosity.
Absolutely. And so we've both been using the phrase lived experiences. Would you care to give like your own kind of definition of like what that means to you, just so that we can kind of frame that for our audience?
Sure. I've never been asked that before, but a lived experience.
Mm.
I would just say quite simply, it's those events and circumstances that help to make us who we are.
Yeah.
Whatever
Right.
those might be. So it's the accumulation and the culmination of those things. One of the things I say to people all the time through storytelling is that we're not just one story. So
Mhm.
sometimes you talk to a person, they'll share with you this, and sometimes it's a good thing, or sometimes it's a shadow story. It's something that they continue to share because they are listening to monkey chatter, or they've just gotten too comfortable. They haven't done enough of a deep dive.
Mhm.
And we all are multiple stories. And so if we recognize that, then we recognize that who we are is a composite. And it also is an opportunity for us to be mindful of what are we giving airtime to, and perhaps what are some things that we need to spend more time focusing on as well. So that's some of the work that we do with leaders around helping them to let go of maybe their shadow story and helping people to really surface what's really theirs to do in order to be more effective.
Yeah, I like that analogy of the shadow story. It's like it's there, it's around you, but it's not really you, you know.
Right.
And I really liked your definition. So this kind of accumulation of personal experiences and kind of like the wisdom we gain,
Mm-hmm.
that's lived experiences, right? And so I want to kind of keep going with this thread about kind of sharing our stories and
Mm-hmm.
kind of that rub of either our stories won't be heard and appreciated, or gee, I really have nothing to share, like that kind of false belief. And so, um, for folks that you know understand that there's power in sharing our stories and making those connections in the workplace, um, who also are trying to navigate, wow, this feels really risky, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel really vulnerable. How can you, like, how do you encourage folks to move past those fears and um, work with you on establishing that safety? So, one, how do you establish that safety when you're encouraging people to share their stories? And then, how do you get them to open up and just to begin to excavate what, looking back at that accumulation of lived experience and the wisdom, what exactly can you share that will, like you said, that kind of quick connection, building trust and empathy and understanding across differences in the workplace?
Mm-hmm. It's a tricky thing because it depends on where you're starting or what's your angle. I would say to you, going back to what we said earlier about who we are being a composite of stories, I think sometimes when I do storytelling work, people think that you have to start with your deepest, darkest secret, or you have to start with something risky. And I'm a big believer that not everybody deserves
Yeah.
or is deserving of a certain story. And so I think we spend a lot of work just building the foundation and doing the groundwork. So maybe we don't start at something so intimidating or so profound. We start with just a lighter experience of who are you, what's the story of your name, who have been your heroes or sheroes or theyros, and or
Yeah.
your positive
I like
influences,
that.
who have so just those things can start to build that up. And even for some people on the team, why did you take on this work? I work with a number of nonprofits, and so people are very passionate. But what I've also seen is where people make assumptions based on people's physical representation. So I'll just be very candid. Sometimes I've had people say, well, I don't know why this person's involved because they're white, or this
Mhm.
person is a man and he says that he's involved in feminist work, but he's a feminist. Why? I don't get that. So I think sometimes just kind of slowing down and saying, and this goes back to kind of my Native American roots of before you go and do the work, you have to know who's in the circle with you, who's part of the community.
Yeah.
And that can be done just by having simple conversations to say, why are you here? What are your motivations? Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you grew up. What are your values? What's important to you? How can we best support you?
Mhm.
So the wonderful thing about that is once you do that, it builds trust.
Yeah.
And once you start building trust where you have your expectations are consistent with the reality of what's going to take place, then you can start to hopefully build upon psychological safety, which is another layer of the that workplace culture. And Edmondson talks about this quite a bit. That's what she's known for, is this whole idea of psychological safety, which is you being able to perceive how safe the environment is for risk taking. Yeah. So I think those are important things. And I think then from there, once you lay the foundation, then it becomes easier for you to start going a little bit deeper. But I think also setting parameters and guidelines and making sure that people understand what's expected, what's not. Also understanding that the stories around diversity exist all over the workplace. So they're not just, sometimes people say to me, I don't talk about this stuff. I just come to work, I do my job. Then I'll say, well, when you are asked about your weekend, when you look at vacation policies, when you look at benefits, when you look at cultural norms around who's giving spousal benefits, or who's sent to certain parts of the country or the world, how do you have to prep, how you make decisions in leadership. There's all sorts of mini stories in there that are informed by our cultural experiences. Mm-hmm. So then you start to say, okay, if we understand that culture is all around us and we understand that these things exist, then how can we start to deconstruct why we do some of the things that we do, and what's the cultural basis for why we do them, and what's the story behind them? Why did you, for example, assume that when we make decisions that they should always be hierarchical, or they should be always made by one person who goes in a room and takes information and then makes a decision, as opposed to a collaborative structure? Mm-hmm. That's a good way to start helping people to see that culture exists all around. But I think once you make the instant connection, once you cultivate community agreements where people can be safe, then I think it's an opportunity for you to start looking at things, start building upon that. But it requires leadership and it requires courage. And that's not something that leaders are always prepared for. And that's not something that we've set up workplaces to do, which is why we do the work we do, to change that dynamic where people feel like they can be more of themselves. Because a lot of people do feel like they can be themselves. But I think there was a statistic that about only 4 out of 10 people in the workplace feel like they have safety. Many people are covering, and I don't have all the statistics right here with me, but I think it's upwards of, 70% of people feel like they have to cover at some point. And so part of what has to be done too, just to wrap this up, is we have to frame what storytelling is in the workplace, because sometimes people think it's, I just come in and just let you know everything. And it's not that you tell everything, it's that you are able to share things that are relevant to helping people understand your experience in the workplace and how you could be supported more effectively and what you bring to the table as an employee.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think on that piece of kind of the balance of the TMI versus what is relevant in this moment and how can you make that fast connection, I think that's super helpful. And also almost kind of like the bumpers that you put around, or the parameters of sharing stories. So what needs to be in place before we even get to the point of excavating this really important story, right? And and I think you gave us a lot of good guidance around that. I also like what you said about knowing who's in your circle. So really understanding why people are showing up. And sometimes you don't get that in a workplace. It's like you're excited, you get this job, you're there, you're working, you kind of meet colleagues as you go along. But very rarely do you have, at least from my experience in the workplace, very rarely do you kind of say, welcome, Rhodes, this is why I joined this organization, and and why did you join? Usually if you're new, people will ask you that, but you don't have that kind of shared connection immediately of the why. Right. So I think that's really really helpful. So we're going to leadership now. So kind of thinking about these old models of leadership. The infallible leader knows everything. There's no cracks in the armor. The idea of being vulnerable and actively pointing out differences for this kind of older model of leadership may be seen as a liability, right? So when we're thinking about younger people entering the workforce, so millennials, digital natives, Gen Z, whatever we're calling the next generation, younger generations really want to understand their leaders and the path that they've taken, and especially understanding mistakes that they've made and how they've worked around them. So how do you, in the executive coaching that you're doing, how do you coach leaders specifically around, one, the power of diversity storytelling, and then two, inspiring them to give it a go and to try it out? I mean, do you sense that resistance, or is that changing?
I do sense the resistance, and well, let me backtrack.
Yeah.
I sense I wouldn't even call it resistance as much as it is. I think a lot of people actually crave deeper connection in the workplace. We're working 10 to 12 hours a day on average. We're working with half as many resources, which means a lot of us are spending time away from our loved ones in these environments. So it's really important to make sure that you do feel validated, that you're not working 12 hours a day, half of the day, and feeling unsafe. I think people don't know how to do that. And one of the things I say to leaders is, when you first come into a group, or even periodically, even if you have an existing group, I think it's important to take some time just to assess, who is everybody? How do you work? And keep in mind, too, that work style, work temperament, leadership style, those are also aspects of diversity as well. Now, when we get to the cultural piece, is that our culture informs how we do that. So let me give you an example. Being from the Midwest and being African American, what I've taken from African American culture is, I'm a collectivist. I like to understand and help people to understand that we're all in this together, that their opinions are respected. So that's informing that. And so if I'm going to work with a group, I think it's important to, before we start talking about projects, to sit down and just say, who's here? How are we going to work together? How do you like to receive information? What are some triggers? What have been your best experiences? What have been your negative experiences? All those contain story. And once again, those lay the foundation for what you're going to do. I think it's also critical to explain to people why you're asking to tell story. Because it sounds great, it's a nice buzzword, but what's the connective tissue between storytelling and what it is? So if I say to someone, well, I'm here I want you to tell a story, I can see someone saying, well, is this bedtime? Why are you asking me to do this?
Yeah.
But I think also, as a leader, you have to model it.
Mm-hmm.
So for leaders, you have to say, I am doing this and I'm showing up in this way in order to inspire other people to be as open and vulnerable as they feel comfortable, but also making sure that you create the guidelines so that people are not expected to share beyond what's their comfort level. That also has to be there too. So I think if you do those things, I think it becomes easier for people to show up. Now, as an employee, what I would say to you is, and when I talk to my students, everything depends on story.
Mm-hmm.
When you meet that special person, when you're going for a job interview. So story is not just opportunity for you to share a deep part of yourself. It's a way for people to get to know you beyond your resume or your brand. That's what, when I hear brand, when I hear, what's your super person talents or whatnot, there has to be a story around that. Like, why should I trust you? Why should I work with you? How can I ensure that we're going in the same direction? So story it's a cognitive shorthand way of letting people know that you have the talent, the skills, and the same motivations as they do, and they should trust you in doing that. So that's a way that I think helps to do it. And I think, once again, testing the environment, but also making sure that you use stories that are appropriate, that you see what things may land well and what not. Don't put everything out there, but also finding those allies, those people with whom you can share the stories with, so that you can once again become a bigger leader, more visible within the workplace. So it takes steps. And one of the things, and maybe you can appreciate this too, Rose, is, as an LGBTQ person, I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't so easy to share stories. Not that it's entirely easy now, but when it wasn't so easy to share stories about being LGBTQ, for example.
Yeah.
And I think when I'm talking to younger people, I would encourage them to be more savvy and strategic about what they're doing. Because sometimes you get people who just say, I'm just going to be out, and here I am, take me, on any number of issues. You could be someone just saying, I'm just going to keep it real on my political views and whatnot. And I always say to people, take time to understand the environment, take time to understand where you need to go, take time to understand the people who you need to get there and what their sensibilities are. And yes, share part of yourself, but give people enough to support you, but also understand the environment in which you're in, so that you're doing so in a really value-added way, and you're not doing it in a way that alienates people from you because they think that you're trying to bring too much attention to yourself, or that you don't have situational awareness of what's going on around you. So it's a give and take, and it's not something, unfortunately, and I don't even know if this is a good thing for the workplace. I don't know if it's good for people to come and share everything, but I think it's good to be measured and reserved and to be thoughtful about what you're doing, because even if you are a good storyteller, if you don't understand why you're telling it and what's the connection to the people around you, and this goes into story listening, if you don't understand why what you're doing is important, then you'll lose your audience and you'll turn them off. And we see that all the time too in different leadership circles.
Okay, so there is a lot in what you just said, and so I think the piece that I really want to underscore, and definitely coming from LGBT communities, I think we're particularly attuned to this, is like really assessing the environment, like you said, to determine, am I safe here,
Mm-hmm.
and beyond safety, can I connect with the folks that are around me? So I like what you said. So kind of look at the environment, think about where you want to go in the workplace, and consider the people on your team and what you need to share enough to support yourself, like what you're saying, and then consider taking a risk of sharing a little bit more as it's appropriate, in the workplace to make those connections, but avoid the TMI of like sharing everything, because
Sure.
that might not be appropriate, right?
Sure.
And so, we were talking specifically about giving leaders the courage to be a little vulnerable, look at their lived experiences, and share an aspect of their diversity story, and recognizing that everybody has one, right? And so and I think a lot of what you shared on kind of tips and how-tos can apply to a general audience, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of giving you the floor, what might be something that your everyday worker, they may not consider themselves a leader. If they're participating in this summit, they certainly are a change agent, right? But
Right.
for folks who feel a little less empowered in the workplace, what might you say around this concept of diversity storytelling? And outside of the safety factors that we just highlighted, what are some other things that they may need to know, to gain that confidence to share their stories, or at least to start excavating them and considering, do I even have a diversity story, and what is it?
Well, I think you just hit on it. The first thing is recognizing that we are we're more beautiful than we imagine ourselves to be. And so recognizing that, once again, there's a multitude of stories out there. And so let's say, for example, I'm a frontline employee and I'm a person of color, and I'm wondering, well, how do I get myself out? You know, um, get people to know who I am. You have a catalog of experiences to choose from. So we go back to lived experiences. I don't necessarily have to share, for example, my experiences with law enforcement to ingratiate myself to people. But how about the grit that I displayed by, you know, working in or living in a working class neighborhood, or the ability that I had as I was maybe commuting or walking through different areas in my community of of connecting with different people, of code switching, those types of things have allowed me to be successful as an employee. Maybe it's just the grit that I showed by persevering when expectations were low, or people told me that I couldn't succeed for a particular reason. That's where, once again, a lot of what underrepresented groups possess in this society are the leadership attributes that they need to succeed in the workplace. And so we don't tap into that. We tap into the stories that are the most fantastic, or the stories that are the most dramatic, or even quote unquote the most controversial, and that's not really safe. And so, number one, and I don't know how strategic it is, I think the ultimate thing you have to ask yourself with anybody is, what's your goal here? What's your core objective? Is my objective to get to know people? Then share stories about where you grew up, your neighborhood, the schools that you went to, what your experience is like. Use that as a way of creating that space, that safety for yourself, where people get to know you, and then as they get to know you, maybe you can share a little bit more. Learn to understand that if my point here is to build strong relationships and to show people what I'm about and where I'm going, then talk about your aspirations and your dreams, and talk about how you've been able to manifest dreams and manifest achievements along the way, even if you didn't have a lot of support, if you had meager resources. Those are the things that you can do. And so that's why I say start small. But once again, I think for a lot of people, and I've been in this boat myself, there have been times when I realize or forget how powerful I am, and how much I have to offer, and that there's a number of things I may do every single day that may seem routine, that may seem they're not really flashy, but to someone else, they can be a connection point.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important thing to realize is that sometimes we're going for the gusto, and we just need to maybe temper our expectations or use some of those other stories that perhaps we think don't have a lot of energy to them, kind of polish them off, and then bring them to the forefront and use them as a way of helping you to understand that you're a multidimensional person. You're not just X, Y, and Z, and that there's a lot to you. There's a lot of substance beyond what you may look like on the outside or how people may perceive you based on any diversity dimension or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I like what you're saying about this kind of scaffolding, right?
Yes.
Of kind of starting small, kind of testing the waters, seeing how that goes. And then, it's like any relationship. So this, you can think about your personal relationships, bringing that into a professional setting. It's like, you're not going to, like, if you're on a first date with someone, you're not going to reveal like everything that ever happened to you.
Right.
The person will probably run the opposite direction, right? So kind of similar in the workplace, kind of build a strong platform, share a little bit, and then, as you build trust and rapport, you can go deeper with that person over time, right? But you've got to take small bites. And so kind of with that, we've got a lot of good strategies from you of like things to think about in mining our stories, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. But like the other piece is like knowing your audience and, what's some guidance around, like the frontline worker that you were talking about, how would they engage in a conversation with someone who's a peer versus someone who's like a manager or supervisor? Do you have any guidance around just kind of knowing when to share what and with who, or any kind of general tips on that?
Well, I think we're talking a lot about storytelling, but you also have to go back to the listening piece. There's a balancing act that you have to employ there. So I think people are naturally tuned to this. I think if you're coming from a disenfranchised group, we naturally are attuned to survey the environment, to check for danger and risk. So I would say just to fine tune that and just try to understand what's important for the other person. What do they talk about? I think a lot of us do that naturally. But once again, it's all about using it in a more intentional way. So can I trust this person? What are their ethics? Why are they here? What's important to them? But also understand that not everybody is going to be someone with whom you're going to share your story. So that's part of being savvy, and that's part of being doing the correct analysis. Is some people are not going to deserve to hear your story. So once again, it goes back to what's your objective. If your objective is to advance and to make a name for yourself, then find those people who not only have a vested interest in you, have something in common, and people who have the ability to actually help you open doors or to help connect you with other people. Those are people that you want to focus on. I would never suggest to anybody that you tell your story to any and all people around you, because not everybody's going to be able to handle it. But the very good thing is, if you do test some things out, if you do share some things and you find that people don't resonate, that's also good information. So if a person around you, a colleague, for example, when I was working and someone said, "How was your weekend?" and I said, "I was hanging in with my partner," they have a negative reaction. That's information that I can take and use then to say, okay, I know the limits and boundaries of that relationship. I know what's important to me, and let me spend more time cultivating other relationships. It doesn't mean you cut the other person off, but let me spend time cultivating relationships with other people who I feel like can understand me, who can see or share sensibilities with me, and people who can help me grow. That's how you do it. It's something where, once again, I think many of us naturally do this with how we share information in our personal stories. We just have to remember that in the workplace, we have to be more intentional and we have to be more focused as to how we do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And thank you for sharing, the kind of signs where, like you said, if someone reacts poorly to finding out that you have a partner who you're married to who happens to be of the same sex, like they have like even the nonverbals, like you get like some important information, and you've created some parameters of like, okay, I might not go as deep with this person professionally, and that's okay. But we still have to figure out how to work together. And so I think that's also kind of the flip side of like knowing when to share and with whom. And so I think that's really good guidance. I'd like to I'd like to ask you about a few prompts that I've seen. So in doing research around diversity storytelling, there's some information out, at least online, that I find helpful. And some were just kind of these prompts to get people to start thinking about sharing their stories. So I wanted to kind of share some of the prompts with you, and then kind of ask you, how you would coach someone around maybe answering some of these questions that they might feel nervous about. And you may use this in your own practice, but things that I've seen are kind of like on this theme of belonging. Like, when have you felt the pain of not belonging? Can you share a story that reveals uncovering and managing an unconscious bias? Or have you mentored someone from a different background than your own, and what was the impact? Like, these are big questions. And so, are these the types of questions that you ask when kind of helping people start to excavate their stories, or do you start in a completely different direction? I'm just want to give some, the folks that are tuning in, some concrete questions to think about, so that when they're walking away, it's like, okay, I have a journal assignment to kind of excavate my own story. So where would you start, and what guidance would you give around these questions if you have a strong reaction to them one way or the other?
I'm just trying to remember the first two. Could you say those again, please?
Absolutely, sure. So when have you felt the pain of not belonging is the first one. And can you share a story that reveals uncovering and managing an unconscious bias? And the last one is about mentoring people of different backgrounds than your own.
Those questions sound too academic to me. They sound confusing. They sound really complicated. And we know in adult education that you have to bridge things. You can't ask someone to make a leap that's too big, otherwise they will lose any interest and motivation and they will shut down. And I feel like if we're starting with someone who has not thought about this, or someone who's in a leadership position but is a person from an underrepresented group, or someone who thinks about this passionately, even for those people, that's a lot.
Yeah.
What I like to go to, first of all, is just tell us about your family. Tell us what's important to you. What did you grow up? How were the first places and experiences of diversity and inclusion? I would like to know, the simple questions of when did you feel different and what was helpful for you in overcoming that, and how have you helped other people who've not been different? I think stripping away some of the jargonese and just getting into basic things of who are. I mean, we'll go back to story. The best stories. I mean, I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I do, there are sometimes on occasion I'll watch shows, and the best shows are those that are written smartly, but they don't make me feel like I have to have been a scientist to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And so with those questions, I think there needs to be a gradual buildup. And I think what we want people to do is not answer with their mind and their brain, but answer with their heart as to who they are. That is the piece that, from those questions that you gave me, and I know those are not yours, I'm just they're out there.
It's fine. Yeah.
I think they're a little too intense. I would start simple, and really the key with storytelling is to make it personal. So if I'm asking people about, well, how have you thought about your own unconscious bias and whatnot? It seems like it's focusing more on a theoretical concept or theoretical framework than the person who's actually sitting there. I want to tap into who you are, and that doesn't require me to ask complicated questions. It requires me to ask simple, focused questions that naturally allow someone to open up and talk in a way that's comfortable for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me of, and I'm sure you've been in workshops like these where it's kind of talking about the coming out experience for LGBT folks, and how that's, it's a pretty unique experience for folks within the rainbow family, and outside of it, people are like, what? I don't get it. And kind of this universal kind of write down the 5 most important people in your life.
Exactly.
The most important event that ever happened in your life, et cetera, et cetera. And then turn to the person next to you and talk about anything you want other than the things that you just wrote down, And right. So I feel like those kind of simple activities, like you said, that slowly can get you across the bridge is probably the best way. Yeah. I kind of had a similar reaction when I saw those questions, where I was like, writing in my journal, I would be fine doing it, but then sharing it with other people, that feels really, really risky. So, I really appreciate that. And I think that can help participants who are just thinking about this, if folks who are tuning in who are leaders, you've got some really good guidance, as well as anybody, right? No matter where you are, just kind of start with your own story, start with the things that are important to you, and you can start to follow the breadcrumbs of what exactly you feel comfortable sharing, that can communicate some of the differences that you've experienced through your life, and that might might help you build stronger relationships with other people because they can see you're bringing more of your human to work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so Joel, I have a few more questions for you, and this next one is tough, and you probably have experienced it. It's just, like, what would you say to a recalcitrant leader in the workplace who claims they don't have a diversity story to share, they don't understand why this is important, and they've got all the nonverbals going on, arms crossed, they're sitting in front of you, and they have to be in the room because their CEO told them to be there. Like, I'm sure you've kind of experienced some iteration of this. Yeah. So how do you handle that? Because I think that there's some people who are tuning in that are probably excited about what they're learning. They want to take it back. Chances are they might experience some of that resistance. So any guidance you have is really appreciated here.
Well, I have two different types of questions or two different types of responses. Leadership, first of all, for people who are resistant in that way, it's usually because there's a need that's not being met. And my question for them is, what's the need? Are you feeling like you're not included? Are you feeling like you're going to be attacked? Are you feeling like you're going to be under assault? And usually it's one of those things. So spending some time with the person just to say, what's going on and how can we support you? Because usually people don't want to support others when they themselves don't feel supported. So that's usually, that's one angle. Yeah. The other approach is, as a leader, your job is to cultivate new leaders, to bring other people along. Yeah. If you're not doing, how can you do that if you don't recognize and see their full humanity? Mm-hmm. And so what is helpful is to remind them of that very core principle, but then also to remind them that in terms of emotional intelligence and being able to hold space for other people and to really manage their own emotions and also create space for others, that's a core leadership competency. But I think it goes, if you really want to get to what I call the nitty gritty, you have to really start at the personal level to say, what's really going on? And I think for a number of people, one of the things I left out too is people may not know what to do with it. So if it's not, I don't feel like I'm going to be included, I feel like I'm going to be attacked, it's, well, what do I do with it? Because as I've heard from some people, I'm not here to be someone's therapist. And I said, well, storytelling is not about therapy. I said, you don't watch a show on TV or watch something and then think, okay, I need to be that person's therapist. It's just to deepen your understanding of things. And so I think giving people the tools to understand what's the story to be used for is to be used to help to improve the workplace experience of people that you work with. If they're feeling attacked, creating a safe space and understanding that someone sharing their truth is not designed to be an affront to you and building up the resiliency. We all benefit when everybody shares a story that illuminates who they are. I think if we're talking about, I don't feel a part of it, I think then that's when we have to reframe the conversation. That's why I like the term cultural intelligence, or we like the terms belonging and whatnot, because it implies that everybody should be able to feel like they're included and that they're visible and that they're seen, as long as in doing so, they're not trampling upon the humanity of someone else. Yeah. And that last part is very critical, because I'm not suggesting that, well, if you are a supremacist of some sort, that I'm trying to make space for you to do that, because that by implication means that other people are not going to feel safe. But it's where we can all show up while still affirming the humanity of everybody else. That's what's key. Yeah. And that's where the resistance typically comes from. I remember, for example, being on a military base, and this person showed up before the workshop, and he had his arms crossed, and he was very red-faced, and he just said, I don't believe in this. So my question was, what is this? Tell me, what is this? And he said, well, this diversity stuff. And I said, what's your understanding of diversity stuff? And he said, it's, people telling me that somehow I don't matter, because I'm a white male. And I said, what you do matter. I said, it's not in saying that other people matter doesn't mean that you don't matter. It's not a zero-sum game.
Yes.
I said, but you do matter.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that he was ready to be on the Rose Perry podcast, but I will say that he was able to be present and he was able to show up. Whereas before he had already checked out. He had already written the script. He had already come up with this narrative. This isn't going to be for me. And that's a very real example of how we can do this work in a different way. Other times people are just saying, I got so much stuff to do. What am I supposed to do with story? And I say to them, story is not something where it's going to be an hour or two, but stories are abound in the workplace. They do. And if you can pause and take time to hear them, then maybe the decisions you make will be better informed. Mm-hmm. Maybe if you understand that if you're, for example, you've taken over a new company, there's been some type of merger acquisition, and you listen to the people who are working for the acquired company, then maybe you make better decisions than someone who comes in and doesn't listen. And then, I think this happened with Home Depot in Atlanta, where they had someone who took over the company. It wasn't an M&A, but someone took over the company, did listen to the employees, and was out within under a year.
Wow.
Story.
Yeah.
That's how it works. So I think sometimes when people think about story, and I think this is important to reiterate too, Rose, is we're not talking about magic, sorcery. We're talking about the things, the currency of our lives. That's what story is. It's a very real and tangible thing. So it's not something that you have to reach out to. You don't have to be a Hollywood mogul. It's something that is very real and practical, and something that should be very familiar to people.
Yeah, the currency of our life. You've dropped so many amazing quotes here, but I definitely think that's true. And what you're saying is that, or my kind of takeaway from some of what you're saying is that this kind of thread that you don't just share a story and that's it. It's kind of it's ongoing relationship in the workplace, and that's your stories are a part of that, right? And
correct.
And I like what you're saying about the kind of recalcitrant leader. This kind of like there's a need that underlying that's not being met, and I give you a lot of credit. In whatever public forum you were in, where someone was directly challenging your life's work, right? You're in front of the audience, you're helping people kind of excavate their stories and build healthier workplaces, and someone's challenging you. And rather than getting defensive, you model inclusive leadership by just getting curious of like, well, what do you mean by this diversity thing? And kind of taking that thread further and further until you get to that underlying need. So I think that's really masterful. And I think that's helpful for folks to kind of consider if they are, if you're tuning in, you want to take this information back into the workplace, and you do encounter resistance, get curious about it, and then maybe defensive or angry or upset. And I know that that's hard, but I find, in kind of my own practice, that curiosity leads to kind of breakthroughs sometimes. So I think that's really helpful. Joel, so we're nearing the end of the hour, and I just wanted to give you the floor like one last time. Is there anything that we haven't yet discussed around diversity storytelling that the audience may not know that they should? Any kind of final thoughts, last bits of guidance before we part?
Sure. Yeah. I think the one thing I would leave with is that empathy is one of the most most misunderstood things or aspects of storytelling.
Yeah.
So when a person thinks of it, they think, well, what can I take from this? Because we're not the same, or we haven't had the same experience. And that's not what empathy is. Empathy is not about sameness. It is about understanding the core emotion of the person's experience. So even with me being an African-American gay male who came from a working class background and who a long time ago had Choctaw great grandparents, a person can certainly relate to, I'm sure, any part of my journey that speaks to those universal emotions, the things that are important. Now, but what we can't also ignore is how those things are packaged. For me, the strength that I've been able to accumulate has come from my experiences of being on the outside and what that's like. And so, yes, we want to connect to that core message or that core value, but we don't want to ignore the experience either, because the experience then allows us to better understand other people and get beyond these silly statements of, well, we're all just the same and we're all just coming from a similar place, which, yes, at a human basic level, we are. Yeah. But our experiences do shape our reality and they do make us different. And this is why we have a country, for example, that has many different realities. We always have, but they've become even more pronounced and perhaps more stark now. So we don't want to lose sight of that, because that gives us the richness that helps us to understand more, and it helps us to hopefully create more inclusion where people don't have to go through these experiences in order to get strength or in order to get courage, in order to be, creative or innovative. That's the thing. So, when people have said to me, well, your experiences have made you strong. It's like, well, I like to think I could be strong without going through some of the things I've gone through. And I think for many of our people in the workplace, yes, you can empathize with them and understand where they're coming from, but then let's create situations where they don't have to be superhuman in order to get some of these qualities or to have these experiences, that they don't have to basically go above and beyond the call of duty to do that. Empathy is one thing that's misunderstood, but like I said, we want empathy, but we also don't want to completely separate it from the experience. And I think that's a really wonderful part of storytelling, is that you get to see, wow, you had this experience and I understand you now more. That broadens my horizon. And I also want to create the opportunities for people to be themselves and have different experiences without necessarily experiencing hardship. That's kind of the rub there.
Yeah. As you're talking about empathy, it's kind of, this is kind of my Catholic upbringing, but just this concept of loving the neighbor. I think that's like kind of modern day version of empathy, diversity story listening. And I think that's the piece, that kind of active listening where, wow, you're sharing an experience that I may have never felt in my life, but let me try to like step in your shoes to imagine what that world might be like. And I feel like that's the connection, and that's the, we're in the workplace. We are in a community, right? And we can have a community that's centered around love, or we can all be fearful and kind of be more tribalistic, right? And that's kind of the opposite of what I think we're really trying to get at with this kind of greater sense of belonging.
What I would say in closing is, listening to others is helping you to understand more about yourself.
Yeah,
that's really the key.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity, it's a pathway to yourself by understanding others.
Mm-hmm. That's so powerful. Yeah. It's what's being reflected towards you. Like, what does that bring up for you? And that's a greater understanding of who you are in the world. This is awesome. I wish we had like another hour. I know you have to go. You're busy. So I want to thank you so much for sharing all of the wisdom that you did. And after this interview, for folks that are interested in learning more about Joel, we'll have all of his information up on our Belonging Network Summit webpage, so you can learn more about his official bio. You can learn more about Numos and ways to stay in touch with him. And if you're interested in excavating your own diversity story, you can work with him for sure. So
absolutely.
Yes. So thank you, Joel. For everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out our options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. Every purchase also helps me pay the speakers for their generosity, wisdom, and labor in helping us grow the belonging movement. Thank you, and thanks again to today's featured belonging champion.